Hi, everybody. This is Steve Burkow. Welcome to Macro Social Work Stories on behalf of my partners, Dr. Gary Jones, Dr. Christy Holmes, and Ana Quinones, our wonderful intern and junior partner. I'm happy to bring you our next YouTube podcast that we're excited to have today. We've got two remarkable speakers and activists with us, Pauline Pisano, not only a social worker and graduate of the Silberman School of Social Work, but a singer-songwriter who also is deeply involved in the Poor People's Campaign. Pauline has been able to make sure in this work that to connect across the state to other areas of our not only New York, but our country. And in that process has met Becca Forsyth, herself a remarkable social worker with her own story, living in a small town in upstate New York, where also the Poor People's Campaign is now being formed. So, Pauline, I'd like to start with you about if you could tell our audience just a little bit more about the Poor People's Campaign, why social work should be involved in this. What is it that's central to the work of Reverend Barber and others in this work?
Yes, I would love to. Thanks so much for having me, Steve. I think I'd actually like to start a little bit maybe with a story. So my name is Pauline. I use the pronoun she, her, hers. I was a graphic web designer and musician for most of my life, up until about 2007, when the market crashed and I completely lost my job, and I lost what I thought was a safe job. I haven't really financially recovered from that. And I actually think that that's kind of a very similar moment to where we're at now. And the reason I kind of wanted to start with that is because this is why I'm a part of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. It's a moral fusion organizing movement where, we really talk about the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, ecological devastation, militarism, poverty, the war economy. I mean, we're talking about a transformational change that we need to have in our nation, because the working class members, we are not safe from this structure. So that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of here. And so I became a social worker because I really started to see, and I became a macro social worker because I really started to see how the systems were kind of crumbling. And so that's why I'm with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival. And that's why social work really has to think about, like, bridge this micro macro divide, because it's really it's a systemic issue that we're facing. Our environment is unjust. Our environment doesn't value healing. It doesn't value social workers. And so, I think social workers really need to see themselves and their positionality in this movement. And I think that we really need to have that kind of leadership happen, and kind of understand ourselves from that area. And as Steve said, I also do a lot of cultural arts organizing, because I think that it's a process towards humanization, that we are all actually creative, that we're all actually artists, that this is something that has been socially conditioned for us to think that that's not who we are, but actually thinking about arts practices as a way towards humanization for people and whole communities, I think is extremely important. So we engage in that level as well.
That's great. There's a lot in what you said. So, Becca, your involvement, what is it that led you up there in a fairly small town, small city in New York, upstate New York, to become involved in the Poor People's Campaign? What's your story that would lead you into this work?
There are so many stories that led me into this work, but I think the most critical was the fact that 10 years ago, my husband was bitten by a mosquito in Elmira that caused encephalitis. He was in ICU for a month. A year and a half later, he had a heart attack. We are 10 years down the road. He still has cognitive functioning, emotional dysregulation issues, migraines all day, every day. It took us a long time to understand how that fit in the world. For a long time, he felt like that mosquito came to bite him intentionally. And we really had to think about how much damage we as a society have done to the environment that allowed that condition to exist for that mosquito to be able to bite him. That was all of our fault. That wasn't the mosquito just targeting him. But when we get stuck in these worlds of oppression, we get stuck with our faces in the microscope. We are constantly examining minute to minute what is happening, and we're not able to see the bigger picture around us. And we need folks who are able to pull that lens out and start looking through the telescope and see these interlocking injustices. And I see them in so many stories. And I look at Elmira, that is home to not one, but 2 maximum security prisons. And I see how we have a school to prison pipeline in our own school system. I see that our high school is built on toxic land because of the Industrial Revolution and the scars that it left on my community. And I watch all of this, and then I hear Reverend Barber, and I hear him explain how this is all interlocking, how you can't take on systemic racism unless you take on poverty, unless you take on the war economy, unless you take on ecological devastation, and until you start to break through those false narratives that say that a few are allowed to survive and the rest of us aren't worth it.
That's right.
That's not what we believe. And one of the reasons that drew me through social work is because they say, well, all right, you look at the glass half full or half empty. What does that tell you? It tells me someone's stopping you from getting to the tap. Why isn't your glass full, and what can I do to help you fill it? That's my goal. And I know that the only way we're going to do that is together. So that I know places like Elmira are mind-blowing to some folks in the city. They've never been out here. They've never seen the beauty out here. They don't understand what it's like to live here. But we are under those same interlocking injustices that they are. And we have to walk across those lines of division and become that family in order to make any of this move. And if social work's not in the middle of that, then I don't know what social work is doing. Because I was going through my master's degree while I was being introduced to the Poor People's Campaign, and it was like watching my books open up in front of me. This is exactly how this stuff is laid out to help us. And the marriage is just perfect, and it's right there.
That's right.
That's wonderful. There's so much in what both of you have said. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, which is how much people, social workers as well as people in general, get swept up in the little things, those little things that sort of, and they can't see the bigger ones. I mean, your powerful story of you and your husband with the mosquito. Are there other examples of that you could speak to that social workers can tend to get a little bit too much into the weeds or a little too small rather than being able to see some of those things? And then for both of you, what's some ways to help them make those connections? What do you see as something that the Poor People's Campaign has done that can help people see, hey, my individual story, my little thing that I'm working on is really part of something much bigger?
There are so many examples. I work in domestic violence. One of the pieces I graduated from school with was Violence Against Women and Children certificate from Rutgers. So I dove right into that kind of work. And then I realized that there are organizations out there that claim to be for survivors, and they're more focused on treating DV as a housing problem. Well, sure, DV is a housing problem, but DV is so many, domestic violence. I shouldn't be using short phrases like that, but domestic violence means so much more, and it affects every part of their life. And we need to be able to wrap ourselves around that, their entirety. Because if you're not looking at a person holistically and you're only treating their housing problem, you're certainly not helping them fix any of the cycles that got them where they are.
Great example. Pauline, do you have one? I know you've been doing work in this area for quite a while. The kinds of things that maybe some of your peers in the school once got, the type of things they'd look at and how you helped them get past that to have the kinds of conversations that Becca is speaking about.
Yeah, totally. I think, we hear a lot, I'm sure Becca will totally feel this and chime in with me. We hear a lot in social work about trauma-informed care. But the thing about trauma-informed care and how it's getting siloed and used is that a part of trauma-informed care and treatment is to empower people and organize people to change the conditions that created the trauma in the first place. And so like when we think about like domestic violence, when we think about the pandemic, we're in multiple pandemics, like the patriarchy is like a virus in and of itself. White supremacy is a virus in and of itself, but like we're getting siloed into thinking that it's I think we're moving a little bit more up to like the meso level, to thinking that it's like, it was like very individualized blame, which is a whole other topic that we could talk about, like, you know, American exceptionalism and individualism and how that actually perpetuates poverty. But we're also thinking about, like, you know, we're looking at family systems, but that's not the whole story. It's an environmental thing. And I've heard for my own self and for people I'm with, like, the community organizing treats trauma. And you treat trauma because you are changing the conditions that created that in the first place, and you're transforming it. And what are we other than beings of transformation? I mean, I'm also a sound nerd. And so if you think about like the actual physics of sound, it is transformation in an environment. Things move. And so, you know, it goes back to that humanization thing that I think I was talking about earlier, is that it's really, if you have an environmental analysis, you actually humanize and transform systems. That's the best trauma-informed care I can think about.
Well, and it brings to mind the MLK quote that we talk a lot about. This is more than flinging a coin at a beggar. You've got to start asking yourself, who owns the iron ore? Why in a world that has 2/3 water are we paying water bills?
That's right.
These are the kinds of questions we really have to ask ourselves.
That's right.
Those are great questions that leads to it. You talk about the water bill, and suddenly you get to a whole deeper level of system. I want to invite our other co-hosts here, if you have questions or comments that you'd like to bring in, to jump in here at any time, because this is a really deep conversation that has a lot of different points to it. Either of you want to go, or I'm happy to keep going here, but you know, I don't want to just keep chiming in. Chris,
Gary, are you going? Oh, all right. I was still on the trauma-informed care part. I was thinking, okay, so if we have a classroom full of students, we have stories like this, and it usually piques their interest, of course, and they'll even get worked up about it. Maybe they'll send a letter. If some aspect of a story motivates them. But what would you want them to know that they can do as students or as new practitioners? Like, how does this translate in the classroom and then out of the classroom? And like you were saying, Anna, you're already doing social work, even if you aren't officially stamped yet. And so the more practice, the better, right? And so how do we influence our communities, our fellow students, or our colleagues to make a difference that actually is going to help change some of the systemic issues that aren't too overwhelming? And that's, I think, where we get stuck a lot, where we give a huge list of things, or you need to write this op-ed, or all helpful, but less likely to be followed through on. On the other end, we tend to have, here's an online petition, which requires no thought in about 3 seconds, which doesn't really have engagement either. So what's something or some things we can inspire people to do that will actually make a difference over the long term? And it can be more habitual, I think. Big question, sorry.
No, that's a great question though. No, and, you know, and I think that too, you know, the two things can happen at once, where like you do have like the micro healing happen while the macro healing, like those two things happen at the same time. I just think that fourth step we don't get to in schools. But, you know, I think it's also just sharing, like people finding their own social location also. And to think that, like, you know, when we talk about like ICE and abolishing ICE, what that means, that actually helps when we think about that system of oppression getting highlighted and people organizing against it. That actually helps survivors, you know, that like these systems are actually interconnected. So if students found their own social location, because, you know, oppression isn't equal. It would be, you know, not a smart thing for oppression to be displayed equally, because then we would all band together and be like, we're not going to take this, but it's unequal. So I think it's like students understanding their own social location and their own conditions and finding their narrative in it, and then finding an organization or a movement that speaks to them in their locality, and then joining a mass organization like the Poor People's Campaign or something like that, that is going to hold the line. I think it's like those steps to kind of inspire, but I think a lot of it can come from our stories, because for a long time, I didn't realize my own social location. And I, you know, was on 99 weeks of unemployment in 2008, and I didn't know what was happening. And I thought it was all my fault. And it wasn't really until the Poor People's Campaign came out in 2018 that I understood, oh, that wasn't my fault, but I didn't have the language for that yet, you know? So I think some of it is that language. And Paulo Freire, if I'm saying the name right, comes to mind. To name the world, like to name the world is a really huge thing. So I think if we help students name themselves and their world, something will come out of it.
Great answer. I'm follow up, and this is more to imagining the students, and what I've come up against before is ICE, defund the police. I'm in Los Angeles. These sorts of campaigns, the pushback that comes from that. So as a student, I support ICE. They provide an important function. Here's a list of all the things that have happened that are very bad, and why ICE is needed. Or why would you want to defund the police system? I serve on a neighborhood council, and it's much older, and their views of defunding the police are dim. And a lot of the work happens in some of these neighborhood councils that go to the city council. So that is a surprise. You know, even after all these years, it's a surprise at how we have to educate on what the terms even mean. What are we actually asking for? So I'm not saying I'm for or against how we name them, but when we say abolish ICE or defund the police, I'm finding that there is just a huge wall of, now I don't want to talk to you.
Oh, you're absolutely right. That is definitely something we struggle with. I am currently running a mini study based on police reform in New York State. Our governor has issued an executive order that all the different police departments have to be able to submit some kind of a police reform plan. And there's all these rules about how the community is supposed to be involved. Well, we have folks from all across the state that are all identifying very big holes in the system that they're seeing applied in their own locality. And it's fascinating to watch how it's applied differently in different communities based on who's the decision maker in those communities. But until you can pull that lens out and see that, you know, there's one local community that thinks that they were right on the ball because their stuff is already written up and they're going to send it to the governor and it's going to be approved. But the bottom line of their reform is, I'm going to show up at your door in a gray uniform instead of a blue uniform. That's not reform. And folks don't understand because they see things. I've spent all summer watching what happened in Rochester, and my heart is just so broken. But other folks look at what happened in Rochester, and like you said, that's a big line of division. Folks are like, oh, well, they were burning down the city. They were hiding in a church being gunned down by police. This is not the same thing, but this is what the war economy brings you. So unless we're really able
Becca, and that's demilitarize the police, perhaps. So that's focusing on certain things, I feel like, is a way to help reach students who may sit silently in class, or if they ask a question, they feel shut down pretty quickly. This is feedback we've gotten to. If they disagree with the overall premise, they don't hear anything else. And so if we bring something like, this is what the local police have, and that's helped here. Do they need all of this for LAUSD Police Department? They have tanks, you know? So
right.
you can engage just about everyone.
Absolutely. You start looking at Binghamton, a little bitty city not far from me, has a tank because of 1033. Why does Binghamton need a tank? There's arguments that you can make in big cities. I don't agree with them, and I'll shoot down every one of them, but there's arguments you could make. But that's why you got to kind of go back to, how did policing start? Why are police the way they are today? And once you can start getting the buy-in to the roots, we call ourselves root doctors in the Poor People's Campaign. We think it's really important to identify the roots, because if you don't understand the root, you're not going to get the problem and you're never going to find the solution.
And I'm sure Gary and Steve have something to say about even social work's roots and contributions to this.
Yes, absolutely.
So I appreciate this conversation. As we look at, many people call this the third reconstruction, where we really have to look at everything. And sometimes in many professions like social work, we look at it only on one level. And what I hear you saying is that they're interrelated. Policy, practices, and history. His story, because we look at why we have law enforcement from the conception to protect and serve the have, not the have-nots. And so now we're saying we want the have and the have-nots to be protected in a system that has not always had the best interests of the oppressed, the least of these.
Absolutely. And you connect that to a town that wants to make the major corporation in their town the voice maker when it comes to police reform. Yes. Gosh, why would it be up to the corporation to make that decision? Oh, because that's the property we're here to protect.
Yes. Yes.
Right. You've got to make those connections. Definitely.
Yeah. So thank you. And so Miss Anna, as a emerging student, but because you're on the front lines, what kind of things could we do better as a profession to bring reality to the classroom?
I really don't know, to be honest. I would say like have more like have students have more like hands-on experience, but I wouldn't know how that would go due to like the pandemic and stuff. But if the pandemic wasn't here, then I would think that would be a little more helpful, because like when I was in when I was in my community college, LaGuardia, I was taking human services, which is like similar to social work. And before I graduated, we had this class where it was like we had to like shadow a social worker, and I really like I really enjoyed it and whatever, because like it made me more motivated to like actually become a social worker. I was very hesitant on whether I want to do that or do something else. So yeah, I don't.
So exposure, but the pandemic has really exposed our society and the numerous disparities, inequities, because just look at gender and households and how many women, for various reasons, had to sacrifice their jobs. Women already are paid lower wages for the same job. But now we see, because of the pandemic, double pandemics, that we're able to see how women are being impacted on a massive scale. Can someone talk about just gender and the pandemic, the impact of how gender has impacted women and the workforce and homes during this time period?
Great point. You also said something, Anna, that's really interesting, which is at the very beginning, you said, well, maybe we could tell our stories, but people may not want to hear them. Well, that's just it. We do have to hear your stories. I mean, that's the whole thing about all of this, that I hear from Becca, I hear from Pauline, I hear from all of us, Gary, and I know Christy as well, is that if we don't hear the voices of those denied power, we're never going to be able to get to the kinds of connections that we need to be able to make, like what Gary, what you just said. So Becca, you're doing something really interesting. It sounds like you're also building, you're starting to build a social justice center in Elmira. What's that been like? Tell us a little bit about that story.
I'm in the infancy stages right now. I have brought together a team of folks that I think will push me in all the different directions that I need to be pushed. I have an expert from the domestic violence and human trafficking area. I have someone from environmental devastation that is really up on how that stuff works. I have two folks that are involved in race relations. So I've tried to really reach across the community and get as many voices as I think will help me to feed what I'm looking for. But what I really want to do is I want to have a twofold approach. I want to have a really strong advocacy arm where I can have a real domestic violence advocate who will actually help someone, again, wrap around that whole person with the services that they need. I want to see a housing justice advocate. We have some of the oldest housing stock in New York State, which means our kids rate highest for lead in New York State because there's no way to fix this stuff. My own daughter and grandson have been involved in that. It's absolutely drives me crazy. But when you have a population that most kids haven't graduated from high school, they don't know the laws. They don't know that they're being exploited. They don't know how to stand up for themselves. So on the advocacy side, I really want to learn how to get the resources in the hands of the people who need them. But then I also want a community resources. I want to be able to build political education programs, maybe a social justice movie night, community dinners, breakfast programs. I have a million ideas. And it's going to take a little time to get there, but I am really excited. There's a lot of energy for it right now. This is a hard time. You know, this has been a really serious season of loss for a year now. We need to be able to mourn that and find space for that and learn how to grow from the tears that are falling.
That's right. You know, I wanna share a little bit. So I like Beck is like, you know, such an amazing sister and leader in this movement, you know. And so when to think about the question gender, I think that's a really important question. And I think that we can tie it a little bit to like, this is like the caring, this is like the caring classes revolution. It's kind of happening right now. So like when we think about like gender is a social construct, and so women identifying people have usually had like roles of care and healing. And so they are systemically left out of an economy because our economy is really a heavily, in the United States, militarized economy. So we're really only paying for harm and like not paying for healing. And so I think like all these things are connected, and that construct we're seeing change right now. People are saying like there is not a binary existence here. And I think that that's a really powerful thing. But I also think that, you know, just thinking about like for the caring, like the program that like, you know, that Beck is talking about is a program where the people on the front lines of these issues are going to be leading the solutions. And so we're going to meet people where they're at and kind of get people together. And I think that that's like a really important, that's a way of healing, you know. And one day we hope that the world that we're because the history is right now. The transformation is happening. We're building the world right now. The new world isn't coming in 10 years. It's happening right now. And so, you know, I think that the vision that Becca's having and like building that out, like, you know, that's the beginning of the change. And so we really need to pay attention to when these things are happening, because we can get there, but we have to acknowledge that we're getting there like today, not that we're getting there somewhere in the future. Otherwise, we're going to get stuck in that wheel of history.
Absolutely. And there's so many pieces to add to that. When we think about when Steve was saying making sure the voices are heard, that's again, especially in our state campaign, one of my favorite parts is our communications and media team. Our media team has made many short films about our leaders. They released at the end of last year an amazing one about Patrick Braswell from the Rochester Homeless Union. And I'm so grateful that they did that, because we lost Patrick this year. And I am just crushed that he is not here anymore. But I'm so grateful that we have his wisdom that we can pass on to other folks and show this is how you help. This is what you do. These testimonials are so important.
That's powerful. Are there any last questions or comments from our host? One of the things we do is we make sure that the people on for the first time are Pauline and Becca, you get the last words. But before we do sign off, I want to make sure if Gary, Christy, or Anna have anything to add to ask you or to add as commentary to make sure you're included here too.
So there's a quote I just would like to reiterate that talks about making sure that everyone is at the table to bring about change. This is a quote in Dr. Barber's book. Because we can never know the essence of the true hope without attending to the tragic realities of the poor and the forgotten. In order for change to occur, everyone has to be brought to the table, and their needs, their desires, and reimagine how things were like if they were put at the forefront to protect and serve everyone, not just the haves. I think it'll be very different in our society.
Beautiful. Christy?
I can't add more to that.
Okay. Anna?
I just wanted to say it was really nice meeting you both, and I really enjoyed the conversation. And Becca, I really hope you do well with building your domestic violence stuff. And yeah, it was really nice meeting you both.
Great.
So glad you came.
Thank you. Pauline and then Becca to wrap up.
Yeah, wow. No, I think one thing is I want to say, like, Anna, like, welcome to the field of social work, because you're here, and that's great. I'm so glad that you're with us. We have a saying in our group that, like, we're not children, but children aren't in the way, they are the way. And so like, our future is here. And I think that's really, really important. And I think it's really important that we listen to what they have to say. I'm like at a lot. I'm at a loss for words right now, with the exception of like, we're the new unsettling force is here. And it's to go back to the statement about, if everyone that had needs was at the table and we all looked at them, I tell people the world would look entirely different. There's art forms that we don't know about. There's ways of being that we don't even know about, but it's there, that, and if we can all find that consciousness that pulls us out of this dissonance of who we are, then like the whole world looks different and everybody really does rise, because everyone is forced to not do what is who they are because of this system, because there's a few people gaining massive amounts of profit, and like the fear of the Amazon workers organizing in Alabama is like massive, but like they deserve 15 in a union, and I benefit from that because the world values the art that we hear on the radio. I mean, I was listening to some songs on the radio and I just, the values in those songs, they're not the values of the writers or of the community that we have. And so, I just think that we have to hold on to the fact that, the world is changing, and the world that we could be living in could be so much better. And if we don't take action, if we don't do that, I mean, you have a world of domination that's coming at our door. And so we really have to hold that there's faith that we are going to win. And yet, there's urgency in this moment. I'll pass it to Becca.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. One of the things that Reverend Barber talks about that just thrills my soul is talking about the rejected becoming the chief cornerstone. And that is so powerful because I spent so many years feeling rejected and powerless and that there was no hope. And I was wrapped in these systems that I didn't even understand. And now that I pull that out, I just don't understand why we can't all stand up for this. Like, this is so critical. There are people who cannot breathe today because of the way this is. And until I understood what a war economy was, I couldn't understand what a peace economy could look like. And that's what I'm fighting for now. I came from a background of dialectical behavioral therapy, and we learn about validation because we all grew up in a world that had no validation. And now that's what we all need to do, is start validating the heck out of each other, because everybody's got a right to live.
Thank you, everybody. This has been an inspiring conversation that I think a lot of people are going to gain and learn from. Again, I want to thank Becca and Pauline for just a spectacular conversation with us all. Folks out there, make sure you come back again next week. We're going to have really another inspiring conversation led by Anna and her good friend that's going to look at the stories within foster care and child welfare and what we need to learn there too in terms of systemic issues and what we as a field need to grow into. So thank you, everybody. And we'll see you at Macro Social Work Stories podcast next week.